So today we are going to be talking about muslin and grain line and how to block muslin especially. Blocking muslin is the first step that you will take towards any sewing project, whether you are creating a garment or some kind of soft sculpture, a quilt perhaps. Basically anything that you are doing that involves sewing muslin and really utilizing it for pattern making is going to be dependent on the quality of the muslin and the fibers within. And so you need to make sure those are all aligned. So I do have some scrap muslin here that I'll be using in just a minute. But first I wanted to open up some plain woven cotton that has been shipped. It is not muslin, it is 100% cotton, but I want to illustrate what a grain line looks like. So ideally when you open up your package of muslin, it'll probably look something like this unless it's already on the bolt still or on a roll. So when you open up your cut fabric, I'm just going to start unfolding. You are going to have a raw edge, and so we'll talk about the raw edge as well as the selvage. So I'm unfurling my fabric, and you can see it's folded in halves and quarters, but basically I have several yards here, so that is the length. The yardage is the length, and then right now we are concerned with the width of the fabric. The width of the fabric is dependent on the width of the loom that it was woven on. So some of you might have 45-inch wide fabric, some of you might have 60-inch wide fabric. That's all depending on the width. It does not really determine the quality. The only difference I've noticed is with certain manufacturers, when it gets to be, say, 120 inches wide, it feels much more like a bed sheet, really soft and something you would want next to your skin instead of having the coarse, rough hand that a lot of muslin does. And so I'll show you some different examples of that, although you can't feel it. So here I have, it's still folded in half, but I have the width of the fabric. And I know that because I have my selvage on either side here. So I can open it up, but I want you to see the difference between the selvage and the cut edge of the fabric. So this is my cut edge. It's pretty clean, right? I have a little bit of fraying, but you'll notice on the selvage, I have some perforated holes here, as well as this really consistently frayed edge. And so the selvage is the edge of the fabric that binds the weaving together so that it doesn't fall apart. And so with the selvage, if yours has perforated holes, it's done to note the face of the fabric. The face of the fabric is the right side. It's the side that you want to use. So if you have worked with patterns before or come across a pattern in the future that says use the face or use the right side, it's talking about the part that you would want to see. If this was a printed or patterned fabric, you would see that print design here because my perforated holes are facing towards the back on either side. So we can open this up. And so again, the selvage controls the fabric from falling apart off the loom. So it runs parallel to the length. All the way up through this yardage, you'll see the selvage on the edge. And so you'll only have two cut edges, one here and one at the end of the length. The thing about a cut edge is that you can never quite trust a cut edge. Within the fabric, you have the woven fibers, so you have the weft and the warp. And the cut edge does not identify either the weft or the warp, right? So if you really zoom in and look closely, you have all of these really, really tiny fibers running vertically and horizontally over one another, and that's creating the weave. So in order to maintain the integrity of our material, we need to make sure that the weave is perfectly perpendicular to each other, that every single fiber is meeting at a 90-degree angle. That is theoretically perfect, but realistically improbable. So the deal with that happening is that a lot of times in manufacturing or post-production of the fabric, or even in the weaving itself, these fibers become warped, not to get confused with the warp of the weave or the weave fiber. But they start to get skewed out of place. And so I'll show you as we get to taking a square of muslin apart, you're going to see a lot of inconsistency in this perfect grid based on the way the fibers have been woven together. And so back to what I was saying, you can never trust a cut edge because it doesn't identify one of those fibers. It's just as arbitrary as the person cutting across at 2 yards or 1.5 yards. So if you are cutting out a pattern piece from muslin, you can never just use the cut edge as a baseline. And that's also something similar to saying you should never cut on the fold, because fabric has these inconsistencies that while it might look perfect and perfectly smooth when you lay the fabric out, but it needs to be blocked first. And so I just wanted you to see the selvage here. I'm going to fold this back up because it is a higher quality cotton, and so it's probably not going to have some of the inconsistencies that we're going to see in muslin in just a second. So I'll set that aside. Here I have a scrap of muslin and the same thing. So I have this raw edge, but I have some selvage over here that looks quite different. Here I don't have any fraying, but the selvage is identified by this double stripe. And there's even some transparency of the fabric itself, but when I get to the selvage, it really becomes opaque and it has a glued binding within the fabric. So it'll feel a little bit stiffer at the edge, you'll be able to identify. And I would also say that everybody's fabric might look different. So I do have other examples here. This is cotton muslin, but again, this is what I was warning about. This doesn't really have a stiff, firm hand to it. So you can see some of the speckling of the cotton that's actually in the fabric, and we have a frayed edge, but this feels really, really soft, almost like a flannel. So I don't want to use it for what we are going to be doing. If you are working with something that is softer, that is totally fine. The only difference is that it's not going to have as much firmness as something coarse, and so that's going to give it a different hand, which can be really advantageous to certain manipulations you might want to do. I have another fabric here, and so this is also a cotton. You can clearly see the threads that are woven going vertically and horizontally, but this selvage looks pretty different. So again, I have the perforated holes. If you have trouble telling which side is the face, you can run your hand on it and you'll be able to feel the indentations in which direction they're poking. But this has a really, really wide selvage, and that's okay. I think this is a looser woven fabric, so it's going to have a little bit more stretch than a tightly woven fabric, but you still have the frayed edges here. So that's a very easy fabric to identify. This one is a little bit more difficult because it just has this very, very fine double line and that glued edge. So the selvage has been removed from this other side of my scrap, but while it was still attached, I marked the direction of the arrow just to keep it consistent. And from one side to the other, the direction of the fabric is never going to change. We're always going to talk about it running parallel to that selvage. So the first thing we want to do, pertinent to our assignment, is we're working with 10 by 10 squares. And so we want to identify the grain line. The grain line is the direction of the lengthwise fibers that are running parallel to the selvage. So right away, I would ask you to unfold your fabric and identify the selvage and draw an arrow directly parallel to that. If it helps, you can also do it on the other side of the fabric too, because as we get working across the material, you're going to want to know exactly where that selvage was because we will be removing it. So the next thing that you should keep in mind is so we will be removing it. We have our grain line marked. The lengthwise grain is the strongest grain in the fabric. And so what I'm saying by that is that there is also a cross grain. The cross grain goes across the width of the fabric. So if you are going to the fabric store, Joann's, Fishman's, B&J Fabrics, and you ask for 2 yards, they're going to cut across the width and give you 2 yards in length, okay? And the reason why they do that is because your fabric might only be 45 inches wide, so there's no way of getting 2 yards out of that, right? So they go the length. And back to the grain line, this fabric can be woven indefinitely long, or infinitely long, excuse me. So maybe it's 100 yards long, maybe it's 200, 300, 1,000 yards long, right? And so the yardage is always controlled by the length of the fabric. The cross grain runs horizontally, and so when I talk about the lengthwise being the strongest, I'm going to grab my thumbs parallel to each other and pull on it. And you can see, and I would advise you to test on your own, the fabric is really, really taut, right? You don't see a lot of stretch. It doesn't have a lot of give. So this is similar to a woven, say, button-down shirt that's been woven without any stretch in it, or a denim even without any stretch. So traditional denim without elastic or spandex. When I pull exactly the same with my thumbs parallel, not on an angle, on the cross grain, you can see that the fabric is pulling a little bit more. It has a little bit more give. So the cross grain is slightly weaker than the lengthwise grain on a woven fabric traditionally, which means that the fibers running vertically are closer together, and horizontally they're a little bit more spaced. So there's more space in between each fiber, allowing it to move more. The last thing I'll talk to you about is the bias. And so a perfect right angle, 90 degrees, the bias is on the 45-degree angle. So if I want to identify the bias in my fabric, I can pull with my, I'm gonna just pinch them here, and the bias is truly elastic. That's where there is the most space between fibers in our muslin or any cotton fabric, and or any woven fabric for that matter. And it really becomes beautifully, it's supple, it stretches, it will fit any curve. If I were to create a garment with a lot of curve in it using muslin or any other woven fabric, I would have to create panels unless that garment was to be on the bias. So when you hear about a bias cut garment, it's utilizing the properties of the fabric on the 45-degree angle to create less seaming and have a greater, closer fit to the body. Okay, so first things first, for our 10 by 10 squares, we are marking the grain line on our fabric, so parallel to the selvage. You don't have to mark the cross grain. If anything, that's really going to confuse you later on when you have multiple arrows in different directions on your fabric. The next thing I want you to do is to go ahead and cut across the cross grain. And so I'm going to go about a 1/2 inch up. I don't remember tearing this line. Maybe I did, maybe I didn't, but we're going to go ahead and snip in past the selvage. So my selvage is almost at a 1/2 inch. Go ahead and give yourself a little bit more. I went a 1/2 inch up, and we'll see what happens. Okay. Also, I want to make everybody feel it's okay if your fabric is really wrinkled like this. Do not iron it before. Okay, so this is what I just tore off. It's actually pretty consistent, which is a little rare, but we'll see what happens when we tear vertically. So that's fine. I'm just going to set it aside. If you ever need to tie patterns together, it's sometimes those strips are great. Okay, so by cutting, it's just snipping and tearing across, we have identified a single fiber of that weft. So if you just pull with your fingers, you'll be able to pull these threads loose. And so we have identified one of the fibers running all the way across the width of our fabric, giving us a true straight line. Okay, so you never want to cut, always tear. And I'm only talking about pieces to block. When you actually get into pattern pieces, you will definitely have to cut your pattern shapes. But this is the preliminary blocking stage. the next thing I'm going to do is I am going to line up my piece of material. If you do not have a cutting mat like I do, totally fine. I have a Cleargraph roller, and I am going to go ahead and mark up from that torn line 10 inches. And so we are working with 10 by 10 squares. I have my mechanical pencil. Just gonna make a mark there. Okay. And to make sure, I'm gonna draw my arrow down here because it looks like it'll be mostly on the next piece. All right, it's okay to have arrows all over as long as they're consistent. Okay, and then I am going to snip, again, about a ½ inch away, making sure I'm removing all of that selvage, and tear vertically, making sure that my arrow is drawn far enough on the inside of my fabric so that I do not remove it and then I'm questioning where it's supposed to be. I'm not going to tear all the way up, so I'm only really going that 10 inches that I need. Save yourself some heartache. Don't remove everything and then wonder where the grain line is on your 5 yards of fabric. Okay, so I already marked it. I'm going to make sure I'm going to a little bit more, and then I'm going to snip again at that 10-inch mark. So I've gone 10 inches up and 10 inches across now. And so I've identified one single, you can see it here, lengthwise thread. My next step is going to be measuring 10 inches from this side over. And so same thing, mark it. So we're making a big square. Okay. And so I've already started to isolate this shape. My next thing I'm going to do is mark an arrow absolutely parallel to the initial arrow so that I always have a grain line on a scrap piece of fabric that I'm working with so I can use it later. If you don't identify it and try to use it later, hopefully you can identify which one is the lengthwise versus the cross grain, but it can still be difficult and you don't want to go through that either. Just gonna mark another one. Okay, so I have created, in theory, a perfect square. So I am working on this cutting mat so that I can illustrate to you if this material is level or not. And so I'm starting here with a, if you do not have a cutting mat or anything ruled like this, I would just use the corner of a table. And so you'll always have one right angle to work from. And then you'll just flip and rotate this just like I am. So imagine this was the corner of my table. Okay, so when I lay this out, we can see that even though that initial strip I tore looked really consistent, it absolutely is not. And so look how skewed it is here. I'm almost 3/4 of an inch, I would say. It's 3/4 of an inch higher on this side. It's totally not level. And so we see it hanging over. So what we want to do to correct this, and we have to before we work on any kind of project. If I was interested in creating a dress from this and I started tearing strips of it further to drape some pattern pieces, all of the imperfections inherent within the muslin piece would then transfer into that draping. And then when I made a pattern from that draping, it would have all of the inconsistencies and imperfections in it. And when I finally went to cut and sew that draping, it would not work. It would have really horrible fit problems that aren't able to be corrected. Essentially, you have to start all over because step one was wrong. Okay, so to correct this, I see some major abnormalities with my weave. That's okay. I'm going to go ahead and fix it. So what we are trying to do is realign the fibers by pulling on the bias. And so we're going to stretch it and then allow those fibers to relax. And that's going to correct the weave of the fibers and to help them realign to where they should be. So go ahead and start pulling on the diagonal from opposite corners. And use your thumb and index and middle fingers and really give it a tug. It's fabric, it's not going to tear, it's not going to fall apart. And you can work your way down to the internal corner. And then back up towards the corner most away from you. Okay, and then again, like I said, use whatever corner you have access to and then start measuring your progress from there. Okay, so now when I line it up, I'm still hanging over, I'm still a little short, but it's not bad. It looks a lot better than it did before. So you're just going to keep working on the bias, so just on those diagonals. Okay. If you see some part, like maybe in the middle, seems short, but the corners are okay, that's all right. You can give it a little extra attention and just focus the pulling on that region. Okay, so let's see. My goal or recommendation for blocking is that it's okay if it never gets 100% there, but it should be 95% there. So I might have moved a little bit up here, right? I'm a little short here. I'll give it one last round. And then I think we are okay. So now I have a square of muslin that has been blocked. It is trued. So when we talk about truing corners, this is one of those things. Oops. And so it is now ready to be pressed. So I'm going to go ahead and take it over to the iron.